$5 billion in gains off an initial investment of $2,000, completely tax-free. By now, you've probably heard about the article that's been going around from ProPublica about Peter Thiel's Roth IRA, that he was able to blow up to an incredible amount of $5 billion or so after a very tiny investment of $2,000 up front. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, a Roth IRA is one of the main retirement accounts here in the US, which allows you to invest after-tax dollars up front, and then by the time you reach retirement age, any gains that are in that account are completely tax-free. So it's a very effective way to limit your long-term tax obligations. However, there are some limitations on the account itself. There are contribution limits. There are also penalties if you withdraw any gains before you reach 59 and a half. However, there are some different carve-outs for first-time home purchases and things like that. I won't get too into the Roth rules here, but I do want to go over some of the lessons we can learn from this whole situation with Peter Thiel. Now, Peter Thiel is a tech entrepreneur. He was one of the founders of PayPal, among many other companies now. He's invested very heavily and aggressively into startups throughout his investment career, and he's built up a very massive nest egg. And I want to highlight some of the more important parts of the ProPublica article now, but before I get into that, just want to introduce myself for anyone who's new to the channel. My name is Jack Duffley, and I'm a 24-year-old real estate investor and attorney. And on this channel, I cover a variety of topics as they have to do with investing and personal finance. So if you like that sort of content, be sure to have a look around the channel. And if you like what you see, be sure to subscribe. But anyways, let's get into this ProPublica article. Now you can read the whole thing for yourself. I've included a link in the description. But frankly, this article is incredibly biased. It really reads as more of a shaking of the fist towards this situation. It's very angry and not particularly helpful. And I think we can still get some lessons out of this, even though that's not really what the article is going for, since we can study what Peter Thiel did and learn from it. And whether you think this is great policy or not, I think that's completely beside the point. The point is we can learn something from this situation and what Peter Thiel did with his Roth IRA. To kick it off, you might be wondering how ProPublica actually got this data. Well, that might be a bit nefarious in itself. It's kind of unclear. It just says ProPublica has obtained a trove of IRS tax return data on thousands of the country's wealthiest people, covering more than 15 years. This data provides for the first time an inside look at the financial lives of the richest Americans, those whose stratospheric fortunes put them among history's wealthiest individuals. And the thing is, this information is not public. This was leaked from the IRS, which I know is a crime for anyone working at the IRS to actually share information about private taxpayers or companies. They're not allowed to do that. This is supposed to be controversial. So I don't know how ProPublica got this, and the fact that they got it and then plastered it all over the internet is a bit concerning. But the cat is out of the bag now, so we might as well learn what we can from it. The beginning of the article talks a lot about how the Roth IRA actually came about and some of the early limits. It used to be that you could only contribute $2,000 to the account. Nowadays, it is $6,000, so thank you, inflation. But that's always been a general limitation on Roth IRAs and IRAs in general. There are limits on what you can actually contribute to these accounts because they are such powerful tax tools. However, there are legal ways to get around those contribution limits, mainly through something like a backdoor Roth, which I'll get into in a second. The article does talk about it, certainly in very negative light, but there's something we can learn there too. But let's get into how Peter Thiel actually started his Roth IRA, because that's where some of the controversy really lies, in my opinion. The fact that the account grew after his initial investment, I think, really is beside the point. That's just what happens when you make investments. The investment can grow, and depending on what you invest in, it can grow a lot. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get back to how he actually started the account. So way back in 1999, Peter Thiel was one of the founders of PayPal, which was trying to revolutionize the way that payments were made, especially in the new internet age. There wasn't really a super efficient online way to make payments, at least not one that had a massive network. They obviously had a very good idea on their hands, so they set out to actually set up the company itself and were issuing founder shares. So each founder would get some larger portion of the business than you might otherwise get on the open market because you're the founder of the business. It wouldn't exist without you being a founder after all. So they were trying to figure out where to put those founder shares, and they settled on the Roth IRA, at least they being Peter Thiel, and apparently some other PayPal people did the same thing or something similar. It sounds like. I don't have the exact data in front of me since it's confidential after all. And as the article points out, in 1999, single taxpayers were only allowed to contribute to a Roth if they made less than $110,000. Like many startups, PayPal offered its top executives low initial salaries and large stock grants. Thiel's income that year was $73,000, the IRS records show. So he did appear to be relatively successful at the time, but certainly was not some massive billionaire at this point, like the article tries to spin. If you read the actual article, it tries to act like rich people are already wealthy, super wealthy, and are using the Roth IRA system to gain game the whole tax system and how it's ludicrously unfair, and that's really what the article's going for. But here, Peter Thiel was a startup founder, and sure, he clearly had some connections and some liquidity that he could pull from, but it's not as though he was some ultra wealthy person like he is now. And it makes sense that he'd get a lot of share-based compensation because the company is new. It doesn't make sense to pay out large salaries if you don't have to, and that's the risk in being part of a startup as being a founder. You usually will get shares because the company doesn't have the cash flows to justify large salaries at the moment. So in exchange for your time, you're getting a future cut of the business. That's generally what makes sense for many startups, and that's why this model still exists today. You can't pay people money you don't have, so the other way to do it is to pay them either with debt or with shares in the company, so that when the company eventually becomes successful, which is not guaranteed, but if it does become successful, that's where you can get some serious payout on the back end. Now, I mentioned there was some controversy in how this was set up, and that's because it was founder shares that were probably at a pretty steep discount to what they really should have been worth. That's where, if there's any point in this whole process where there's actual controversy, I think it's right there. Because apparently, while SEC filings describing the time don't mention Thiel's Roth, they show that he bought his first slice of the company in January 99. Thiel paid 0.001 cents per share, yes, just a tenth of a penny, for 1.7 million shares, which apparently was a very large chunk of the business. So he bought a significant stake in PayPal before it IPO'd for $1,700. But again, it's slightly misleading in that he was a founder, so he had some sort of right to these shares, I suppose you could say, but the sort of gaming here to move it into a Roth at that value might be pretty misleading, since again, there were Roth contribution limits, and this was keeping it under that $2,000 limit, and he got that same large stake in PayPal put into the Roth. So that's probably where you could get hung up in this story, is on the fact that he was able to get such a large chunk in PayPal and then move it into a Roth IRA at effectively a value of $1,700 when it probably was really worth much more, which would mean that he was adding things well below their fair value, which apparently is against IRA rules, but apparently the tax authorities let that stand for 20-something years to this day, and there's no records that indicate that this was not okay. So can you really blame Peter Thiel for doing that when he was just trying to lower his future tax bill by investing in a tool that was made available to him, and no one said that it was a problem? And he checked with his financial professionals, I am sure, and they let him do that. Again, you can think that's a good or bad thing that can happen, but can you really blame Peter Thiel for taking advantage of the tools at his disposal? But anyways, a short while later, the company raised money from investors for $500,000 that June and August, so about half a year after he had moved the money into the Roth IRA or moved the shares into the Roth IRA. Another $4.5 million poured in from the venture fund arm of Nokia and other investors, which the IRS and SEC records show. But after 1999, Peter Thiel apparently added no new money to his account. So it was just that initial investment of a little bit less than $2,000 in value. Maybe it was actually much more in value, but the actual contribution itself was valued at $1,700. And that was all he put into it. And he never put anything into it after that. And what happened next was pretty wild. The very next year, the Roth was valued at $3.8 million. And then in 2002, eBay purchased PayPal, and then they also took the company public. So now all of a sudden, there is an open market for these shares. And by the end of 2002, apparently the Roth was worth $28.5 million, according to tax records. And that was the same time that Peter Thiel actually sold out of his PayPal position. So he took that initial value of $1,700 and turned it into about $28.5 million. So now he was sitting on this big nest egg that was inside a Roth IRA, insulated from taxes forever, that he can now use to invest in basically whatever he wanted, so long as a Roth would allow it, which it allows quite a few things. As ProPublica puts it, suddenly, Thiel had an advantage few investors could claim, his own personal investment bank that wasn't subject to taxation. He could now use the cash inside the Roth to buy and sell nearly any investment he wanted. Thiel used the millions in proceeds from his PayPal windfall to invest in other Silicon Valley startups, as well as his own hedge fund, according to his financial assistant's memo. Once again, Thiel's Roth scooped up startup shares at bargain basement prices. This is where I think the article gets a little misleading again, in that it is very biased against this whole system. Sure, ProPublica can say whatever it wants, but again, I'm trying to get some sort of helpful value out of this, because the thing is with startups, they aren't really worth a lot of money in many cases because they aren't producing a lot of money. There's a lot of risk there. There's a risk that your investment could go to zero. Now, if you're actually being dishonest in investing in these companies and getting them at quote unquote below fair value and using that to game the tax system illegally, obviously that's not okay. That's not really what happens with startup investing in general. Typically what's happening is a venture capitalist is going to take their money, give it to some company that has potentially a very good idea, but maybe not the mechanisms yet to actually execute that idea. And there's a risk that those ideas don't actually pan out or the mechanisms fail or something. And then the company goes out and guess who loses their money? The investor. Startup investing is not the same as putting something into a broad index fund and letting it do work after that. There is a lot of risk involved. Oftentimes, the person is relying on their own expertise in helping the business. It's a very different ballgame, but it's something that Peter Thiel clearly has a knack for since he invested in many different startups and many have paid off handsomely. For instance, Thiel and his colleagues in 2003 founded Palantir, a data-backed analytics company, helped by an early investment from a CIA-backed venture fund. On a similar note, in 2004, Thiel met Mark Zuckerberg, a Harvard undergrad who had come to Silicon Valley for the summer to work on growing the company that would become Facebook. Thiel invested $500 grand, Facebook's first large outside infusion of cash. Those Facebook shares ended up, where else? In Thiel's Roth IRA. An attorney for Facebook later disclosed in a letter filed in federal court. That ensured that Thiel wouldn't owe taxes on his early investment in the company. But again, there's risk there. And again, he's investing in a startup. And sure, it might have been a pretty successful startup at that point, but it's still a startup. There's still a lot of growing pains and a lot of risk to go through. Not every startup is a good investment. Sure, in hindsight, it looks like a great investment because it was, but there's no way of actually knowing that when you're investing in startups. I don't know how many startups that Peter Thiel's invested in that have failed, but probably very many because he has invested quite a bit of money across all these companies. But with venture capital, all it takes is a couple big winners, and those can really carry a portfolio that otherwise has a lot of losers. With a number of these startup investments also paying off, by the end of 2008, the Roth was worth $870 million. This is just the power of compounding interest. You have a few investments early on that do well. Those investments lead to making more investments, which also potentially do well, and then money just keeps growing on itself, again, from this very initial contribution of $1,700. The rest of the article talks about how he basically kept doing the same thing. Apparently, sometime in the early 2010s, he did pull some money out of the Roth IRA and paid a pretty hefty penalty on it, but otherwise kept investing within the IRA to where now it is worth about $5 billion, which is just insane given the very tiny initial investment, if you can really value it at $1,700, but that's what it was on paper. $1,700 turned into $5 billion, all within this U.S. tax shelter. But large parts of the second half of the article talk about some of the reforms that came to Roth IRAs after Peter Thiel's investment, including the backdoor Roth, or the ability to take a traditional IRA and turn that into a Roth IRA by paying a one-time tax penalty, or not really a penalty, just paying taxes on the income that you take out of the traditional when rolling it into a Roth. So this can make a lot of sense for someone who has a big business loss or otherwise has a low tax bill in 1 year. They can roll their traditional IRA into a Roth IRA. Now, the article obviously talks about how this is unfair, unjust, and terrible, but it's something that I'm considering doing in the future. For now, I'm taking advantage of lowering my tax bill by using a traditional IRA and a traditional 401k. But when the time comes, if I have a real estate deal where I can do a cost segregation analysis, which is another deduction that you can take within the US tax system, then my tax bill might be artificially low 1 year because of what's been provided to me by the tax code. And then it makes sense to roll that traditional IRA or traditional 401k into a Roth version to where I wouldn't have to pay taxes on the eventual withdrawal when I turn 59 and a half. It can definitely be a bit complicated. In fact, everything with taxes can be very complicated. So definitely talk with a licensed financial professional if you're trying to do something like this or you're considering it. Since everyone's tax situation is different, thank the government for creating such a nauseatingly complex tax code, but that's what we're working with. But I think the overarching lesson here is that there are some very powerful tools at your disposal within the US, not just with Roth IRAs, traditional IRAs, but elsewhere in the tax code. There are plenty of opportunities within it. Within the complexity, there is opportunity, and some of it is designed intentionally, perhaps sometimes unintentionally, but whatever the case, there are definitely lots of powerful tools within the tax code. Am I saying that you're going to become a billionaire like Peter Thiel by investing like this? No, since this is very unusual. This is definitely one of the outliers. But studying the outliers, I think, is very important, since often it's just an extreme example of what can be done within the system, and is often an example that we can learn at least something from. The Roth IRA is something that's available to just about everyone in the US, so it's definitely something worth looking into. But again, if you want to check out that article, include it in the description below. But if you actually check out the article, it has a scroll bar where on the left of the page, at least on the desktop, as you scroll down, it shows his account value as like a sideways chart, and it shows it get bigger and bigger as you scroll down. It's a little cute. I'll give him that. But like I said, there are definitely some lessons to learn here. Anyways, that's all I've got for today. So if you like this video, please like it, since that would help the channel out a lot. And if you like this sort of content about investing and personal finance, then definitely subscribe, since I put out new videos every single week. And and wouldn't want you guys to miss out. And if you would like to open up a Roth IRA or would simply like to get some free money, definitely check out the affiliate links in the description below, since there's some good stuff down there, and that would also help out the channel. But until next time, take care.